Theranos did not collapse because blood testing was impossible. It collapsed because verification never occurred. The company promised laboratory diagnostics from a finger prick. Investors funded the vision. Board members endorsed the mission. Valuation exceeded $9 billion. But clinical validation remained incomplete. Regulatory oversight was limited. Independent review was restricted. Information flowed internally. Transparency did not. Revenue projections preceded proven performance. When investigative scrutiny intensified, testing reliability was questioned. Partnerships dissolved. Capital evaporated. The failure was not ambition. It was governance operating without enforceable technical accountability.
Theranos was founded in 2003 with the objective of transforming diagnostic testing. The company proposed a system capable of running numerous laboratory tests from a small blood sample. The core concept involved replacing traditional venous blood draws with a finger prick collection method. If technically successful, the approach promised faster results and lower costs. The healthcare diagnostics industry historically relied on centralized laboratory infrastructure. Blood samples were normally collected in clinical settings and transported to large processing laboratories. These systems involved specialized equipment, trained technicians, and complex quality control protocols. Theranos proposed compressing much of this infrastructure into compact automated devices. The vision appealed to investors seeking disruption in healthcare technology. Silicon Valley capital increasingly targeted industries perceived as inefficient or slow to innovate. Healthcare diagnostics appeared to present such an opportunity. The company positioned itself as both a technology developer and a healthcare platform. Its devices were intended to operate inside pharmacies and retail clinics. Patients could potentially obtain laboratory results without visiting traditional diagnostic centers. This concept aligned with broader trends toward decentralized healthcare delivery. Point-of-care testing had long been an objective within the diagnostics industry. However, achieving accurate results across large test menus required extensive scientific validation. Theranos asserted that proprietary microsample technology solved these limitations. The company described internal devices capable of conducting dozens of tests simultaneously. These claims attracted attention across both medical and investment communities. The founder emphasized efficiency, convenience, and cost reduction. Early messaging highlighted the potential to expand testing accessibility. Affordable diagnostics could theoretically increase preventative medical screening. This narrative positioned Theranos as both a technological and public health innovation. The company operated largely in development mode during its early years. Laboratory systems were refined internally within controlled environments. Technical details of the devices remained closely guarded. External validation studies were limited during early development phases. Investors nonetheless viewed the concept as transformative. Healthcare cost pressures reinforced demand for technological alternatives. Retail pharmacy partners also showed interest in expanded testing services. Potential deployment locations included pharmacies and outpatient clinics. The business model combined device manufacturing with diagnostic services. Projections assumed large volumes of decentralized testing activity. Market expectations expanded as the company's valuation increased. By the early 2010s, Theranos was widely described as a breakthrough biotechnology company. Media coverage amplified the narrative of medical innovation. The firm's technology remained largely inaccessible to independent scientific review. Internal development continued under conditions of high confidentiality. The diagnostic vision depended heavily on proprietary engineering claims. Investors evaluated the opportunity primarily through management presentations. At this stage, the core proposition remained a technological promise rather than a verified system. Structural takeaway: early-stage technology visions can attract capital long before technical validation is complete.
Theranos assembled a board of directors that differed from most biotechnology companies. Traditional biotechnology boards typically include clinical researchers and laboratory scientists. These individuals provide oversight on regulatory pathways and scientific validation. Theranos instead recruited directors with extensive government and diplomatic experience. Several board members previously held senior roles in national security and foreign policy. This composition created a board with significant political and institutional stature. However, few members possessed deep expertise in laboratory diagnostics technology. Scientific oversight, therefore, relied heavily on internal company leadership. Board meetings focused primarily on strategic expansion and external partnerships. Operational scientific review occurred largely within internal management structures. Directors received information through executive briefings and controlled reporting channels. This governance structure concentrated technical interpretation within a small internal team. External technical challenge was therefore limited during early board deliberations. The board nonetheless enhanced the company's public credibility. Prominent names created confidence among investors and business partners. Institutional reputation often influences early-stage capital allocation decisions. In Theranos' case, board stature functioned as a signaling mechanism. Investors interpreted board membership as evidence of institutional legitimacy. However, governance structures in regulated industries normally prioritize technical scrutiny. Diagnostic devices require extensive clinical validation and regulatory documentation. Boards overseeing such companies typically monitor scientific milestones closely. Theranos' board structure emphasized strategic influence rather than laboratory oversight. The company's founder retained significant operational authority within the organization. Executive leadership maintained tight control over internal technical information. Board members therefore depended largely on executive summaries of development progress. This information asymmetry limited independent technical verification. Corporate governance frameworks normally balance management ambition with oversight. In Theranos' case, that balance tilted toward executive concentration. The board's primary strength remained external credibility rather than scientific supervision. Partnership negotiations benefited from the presence of highly respected directors. However, oversight effectiveness depends not only on reputation, but also on domain expertise. Biotechnology governance typically requires specialized review committees. These committees evaluate clinical trials, regulatory submissions, and device validation data. Theranos' governance model did not emphasize these technical oversight mechanisms. The board therefore operated primarily as a strategic advisory body. Institutional prestige substituted partially for scientific oversight structures. This arrangement was unusual for a diagnostics technology developer. Capital markets nevertheless responded positively to the company's governance narrative. Board composition reinforced the perception of a serious and influential enterprise. Over time, however, governance effectiveness depends on the quality of technical challenge. Without independent verification channels, boards rely heavily on executive transparency. In regulated industries, this dynamic can create structural oversight vulnerabilities. Structural takeaway: governance credibility cannot substitute for domain expertise in highly regulated technology sectors. Theranos' technology claims centered on a proprietary blood testing platform. The company described a device capable of running multiple laboratory diagnostics from microsamples. Traditional laboratory testing typically requires larger volumes of venous blood. These samples are processed using specialized analyzers inside certified laboratories. Each diagnostic test normally requires specific reagents, calibration procedures, and quality controls. Theranos asserted that its internal devices could miniaturize this infrastructure. The system reportedly used small cartridges containing chemical reagents. Blood obtained through a finger prick sample would be inserted into these cartridges. Automated processes would then conduct diagnostic measurements. The company promoted the idea of rapid multi-test capability within compact machines. Internal devices were described as capable of conducting dozens of tests from small samples. Such functionality would represent a significant departure from conventional diagnostics infrastructure. If accurate, the system could reduce laboratory costs and expand testing access. Healthcare providers, therefore, showed interest in the proposed technology. However, laboratory diagnostics operate within strict scientific constraints. Different tests require distinct preparation conditions and analytical procedures. Some diagnostics demand larger blood volumes to ensure reliable measurement. Microsample testing introduces additional technical complexity. Variability in sample size can influence test accuracy. Laboratory instruments, therefore, require extensive calibration protocols. Diagnostic systems must also undergo validation across thousands of samples. These procedures confirm reliability across varied biological conditions. Theranos maintained that its internal systems satisfied these requirements. Technical documentation supporting these claims remained largely confidential. External scientific publications describing the devices were limited. Peer-reviewed validation studies were not widely available. Independent laboratories, therefore, lacked access to the underlying methodology. Within biotechnology industries, transparency often supports credibility. Published data allows scientific communities to evaluate experimental reliability. Theranos instead relied primarily on proprietary secrecy. Executives argued that intellectual property protection required confidentiality. However, this approach limited external evaluation of device performance. Investors evaluated progress through internal demonstrations and presentations. These demonstrations showcased operational prototypes within controlled environments. Technical explanations emphasized engineering innovation and software integration. The company presented its platform as a breakthrough diagnostic architecture. However, the complexity of laboratory testing remained substantial. Accurate diagnostics depend on reproducibility across diverse clinical scenarios. Achieving such reliability requires rigorous scientific verification. Without independent evaluation, technical claims remain largely untested assumptions. Structural takeaway. In scientific industries, technological claims require transparent validation to establish credibility. Theranos raised capital during a period of strong venture investment in technology startups. Investors increasingly sought companies capable of transforming large, established industries. Healthcare diagnostics represented a significant global market opportunity. The company positioned itself as a technology platform capable of reshaping that market. Capital raising occurred primarily through private funding rounds. These rounds attracted venture investors and high-net-worth individuals. Theranos emphasized the scalability of its proposed diagnostic platform. Investor presentations highlighted rapid deployment potential across retail healthcare locations. Projected revenue models assumed widespread testing demand. If devices operated successfully in pharmacies, patient volumes could expand quickly. This scalability narrative supported higher valuation assumptions. Private markets often value early-stage technology companies based on future potential. Financial projections therefore emphasized growth scenarios rather than current earnings. Theranos communicated that its diagnostic systems could serve thousands of locations. Each deployment site could generate recurring testing revenue. These assumptions produced large potential revenue forecasts. Investor confidence strengthened as successive funding rounds increased valuation. By the mid-2010s, the company's estimated valuation approached $9 billion. This valuation reflected expectations of rapid healthcare disruption. However, Private investment structures typically involve limited disclosure obligations. Unlike public companies, private firms are not required to publish detailed financial statements. Investors therefore depend heavily on management representations. Due diligence processes review available information but may lack complete technical transparency. Theranos' proprietary development model restricted external technical verification. Financial models therefore relied on assumptions about device performance and deployment speed. Capital continued to flow based on projected future market penetration. Several investors interpreted the opportunity as a long-term platform investment. High valuations reinforced market perception of technological success. Positive media coverage further amplified investor confidence. Growth expectations expanded as new partnerships appeared possible. However, valuation increases were not directly tied to independently verified device performance. In venture markets, narrative momentum can influence capital allocation. As funding rounds progressed, expectations of success became embedded in the valuation structure. Large valuations can create reinforcing cycles of investor optimism. New investors often interpret prior funding rounds as signals of credibility. Theranos therefore benefited from a perception of collective validation. Yet underlying technological verification remained limited outside internal laboratories. This gap between valuation and independent validation gradually widened. Structural takeaway: private capital markets can produce large valuations before technological performance is independently verified.
Theranos operated within the regulatory framework governing clinical laboratory testing. In the United States, diagnostic laboratories must comply with federal quality standards. These standards are administered through the Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments Program. The program establishes requirements for accuracy, reliability, and laboratory process control. Laboratories performing medical testing must undergo certification and periodic inspection. Diagnostic devices may also fall under regulatory oversight, depending on their classification. Companies developing medical testing equipment often submit validation data to regulators. This process demonstrates that devices produce reliable clinical results. Theranos structured its operations partly within a certified laboratory framework. The company operated a clinical laboratory in California. This laboratory processed diagnostic tests using internal equipment. Operating within a certified laboratory allowed some flexibility in test deployment. Laboratory-developed tests can sometimes operate under different regulatory pathways. However, accuracy requirements remain substantial even within these frameworks. Laboratories must demonstrate that tests produce reliable clinical results. Quality control protocols monitor analytical performance continuously. Regulatory inspectors evaluate laboratory processes and documentation. Theranos maintained that its internal systems met these regulatory requirements. The company emphasized compliance with laboratory certification standards. However, regulatory oversight often focuses on operational processes rather than engineering design. Inspectors evaluate whether laboratories follow established testing procedures. They do not necessarily validate proprietary engineering claims directly. As a result, regulators often rely on company documentation regarding device performance. Independent scientific publication can supplement this oversight structure. Peer review provides an additional layer of evaluation. Theranos' technical methods remained largely undisclosed externally. Confidentiality limited broader scientific scrutiny of device reliability. The company nonetheless expanded testing operations through partnerships with retail pharmacies. Patients were able to obtain blood tests through these locations. Samples were processed within the company's laboratory infrastructure. Expansion created operational scale while maintaining internal control of technology.
Regulatory systems assumed that certified laboratories maintain reliable analytical standards. However, regulators depend on accurate reporting from laboratory operators. When technological methods remain proprietary, complexity increases. Verification structures are therefore partially dependent on organizational transparency. In such environments, governance and regulatory compliance must operate together. When either function weakens, verification gaps may emerge. Structural takeaway. Regulatory compliance frameworks rely heavily on transparent reporting and reliable internal quality control.
Theranos developed an internal information structure designed to control access to technical details. The company operated with a strong emphasis on confidentiality. Employees were often assigned to narrowly defined operational teams. Communication across teams was intentionally limited. Management described this structure as necessary for protecting proprietary technology. Intellectual property concerns were frequently cited as justification for internal compartmentalization. However, compartmentalized information systems can influence organizational transparency. Employees may only observe small segments of a broader technical process. Limited visibility can restrict internal technical feedback. In complex scientific organizations, collaboration often improves problem identification. Theranos instead maintained strict boundaries between engineering, laboratory, and operational teams. Access to device performance data was restricted to select internal groups. Executives retained central authority over communication with external stakeholders. Technical presentations to investors were controlled through executive channels. This structure reduced the number of individuals authorized to discuss system performance publicly. Internal concerns about device functionality therefore moved through hierarchical reporting structures. Employees were generally prohibited from discussing internal operations externally. Confidentiality agreements reinforced these internal communication restrictions. In many technology startups, secrecy can protect competitive advantage. However, scientific development also benefits from iterative verification. Open peer review and external collaboration often strengthen reliability. Theranos prioritized intellectual property protection over external validation. Internal testing processes remained largely invisible outside the organization. Scientific communities therefore had limited opportunity to evaluate device methodology. This information architecture shaped how knowledge circulated within the company. Executives possessed the most complete overview of operational progress. Board members and investors relied primarily on summarized internal reports. Laboratory technicians and engineers often observed only specific operational stages. This compartmentalization reduced cross-functional diagnostic oversight. When complex systems encounter technical challenges, broad collaboration can identify solutions. Highly segmented organizations may experience slower internal verification processes. In Theranos' case, centralized information control concentrated decision-making authority. External observers therefore depended heavily on executive transparency. Information asymmetry between management and stakeholders gradually expanded. In regulated technology sectors, reliable information flow supports accountability. When verification pathways narrow, structural oversight becomes more difficult. Structural takeaway. Organizational structures that restrict information flow can weaken internal verification and external accountability. Theranos projected revenue growth through partnerships with large healthcare distribution channels. The company pursued agreements with national pharmacy chains to expand testing availability. Retail healthcare locations offered convenient access points for diagnostic services. Patients could potentially obtain laboratory testing without visiting traditional clinical facilities. This distribution model promised high testing volumes across large geographic areas. Revenue forecasts assumed rapid scaling once devices were deployed widely. Retail partners viewed diagnostics as a potential expansion of healthcare services. Theranos positioned its technology as the enabling platform for this expansion. Partnership announcements therefore reinforced perceptions of commercial viability. Retail pharmacies began preparing dedicated testing spaces inside selected locations. These testing centers were intended to integrate directly with the company's laboratory infrastructure. Blood samples collected at retail sites would be processed through the Theranos system. Rapid test turnaround was presented as a competitive advantage. Patients could receive results more quickly than traditional laboratory timelines. Lower testing costs were also emphasized in the company's commercial narrative. Reduced prices could increase patient testing frequency. Higher testing frequency would support recurring diagnostic revenue. Financial projections therefore incorporated both scale and repeat utilization. Partnership visibility further strengthened investor confidence in the company. Public announcements suggested that commercial deployment had already begun. However, operational performance depends on technological reliability. Retail partners typically expect consistent service delivery from healthcare providers. Diagnostic accuracy also carries regulatory and reputational implications. Healthcare systems rely on reliable laboratory results for medical decision-making. If testing reliability becomes uncertain, partnerships may face operational risk. Retail distribution therefore depends heavily on validated technology performance. In Theranos' case, partnership growth occurred alongside limited external verification. Retail partners largely relied on company assurances regarding device capability. Technical transparency remained constrained by proprietary secrecy. This dynamic created potential dependency between partners and internal company reporting. As testing volume expanded, operational expectations increased. Healthcare providers and patients relied on reported diagnostic accuracy. Any uncertainty surrounding testing methodology could affect long-term partnership stability. Commercial agreements therefore introduced reputational exposure alongside revenue opportunity. When partners depend on unverified technology claims, contractual relationships become structurally fragile. The sustainability of revenue projections depends on underlying technological reliability. When verification gaps emerge, commercial relationships may become vulnerable. Structural takeaway: commercial partnerships built on unverified technology assumptions can become structurally unstable as operational scale increases. By the mid-2010s, external scrutiny of Theranos began to intensify. Journalists and analysts started examining the company's diagnostic technology more closely. Questions emerged regarding the performance of the proprietary testing devices. Some former employees described internal technical challenges within the system. Investigative reporting introduced external pressure on the company's claims. Journalistic investigations often rely on interviews, documents, and technical consultations. In this case, reporters examined whether the devices could perform the full range of advertised tests. Sources indicated that some tests might rely on conventional laboratory equipment. Traditional analyzers were reportedly used for certain diagnostic procedures. This raised questions about the capabilities of the proprietary devices. Public discussion of these issues began appearing in major financial publications. Investigative articles highlighted discrepancies between company claims and reported laboratory practices. The reports triggered broader interest among regulators and industry observers. Investors and partners also began reviewing the emerging information. When investigative reporting introduces technical uncertainty, market confidence can shift rapidly. Theranos responded by disputing the accuracy of the reports. Executives maintained that the company's technology functioned as intended. However, the controversy increased demands for independent verification. Healthcare diagnostics operate within strict reliability expectations. Medical professionals require confidence in laboratory test results. If uncertainty arises regarding test accuracy, institutional trust can weaken quickly. Regulatory agencies began evaluating aspects of the company's laboratory operations. Inspections examined laboratory procedures and compliance documentation. These reviews added additional scrutiny to operational practices.
Meanwhile, public coverage continued expanding across financial media. Analysts began reassessing the assumptions underlying the company's valuation. Technology firms often experience increased examination once valuations reach substantial levels. Theranos now faced simultaneous pressure from journalists, regulators, and investors. Partnership organizations also monitored the situation closely. Retail pharmacy partners depended on reliable diagnostic performance. When questions about reliability circulate publicly, operational relationships may become strained. Confidence in the company's technology began to erode among external observers. Without transparent technical data, defending proprietary claims becomes more difficult. Investigative exposure therefore shifted the company's operating environment. The firm moved from narrative-driven growth to externally driven verification demands. Structural takeaway: external scrutiny can rapidly challenge high valuations when technological verification remains incomplete.
Following investigative scrutiny, investor confidence in Theranos began to weaken. High valuations depend heavily on credibility in private capital markets. When confidence declines, valuation stability can deteriorate quickly. Theranos had previously been valued at approximately $9 billion. This valuation assumed large-scale deployment of its diagnostic platform. The valuation also reflected expectations of technological reliability. As external questions increased, investors reassessed those assumptions. Private market valuations are often based on projected future performance. When the underlying technology becomes uncertain, those projections become unstable. Investors began examining the company's technical claims more critically. Board members also reviewed the evolving external reporting. Institutional partners evaluated operational risk associated with continued collaboration. Healthcare providers depend on reliable diagnostic infrastructure. If testing accuracy becomes uncertain, operational relationships become difficult to maintain. Some partners began reconsidering their agreements with the company. Partnership suspensions reduced the commercial footprint of the business. Revenue expectations therefore began adjusting downward. Market perception of technological leadership began weakening. Public discussion shifted from innovation toward verification concerns. Media coverage increasingly focused on laboratory reliability questions. Analysts began reevaluating the sustainability of the company's valuation. Large private valuations can reverse rapidly once uncertainty emerges. Investors seek clarity when technical claims are challenged. Without independent validation, restoring confidence becomes difficult. Theranos attempted to defend its technology publicly. Executives emphasized the company's commitment to regulatory compliance. However, confidence depends not only on statements, but also on verification. External observers requested greater transparency regarding laboratory methods. Detailed validation data remained largely unavailable to the public. This information gap made reassessment more difficult. Institutional investors gradually reduced expectations regarding future growth. The company's valuation therefore began contracting. Private share liquidity also became more constrained. Capital raising opportunities narrowed as uncertainty expanded. When growth narratives weaken, funding conditions often tighten. Technology startups depend heavily on investor confidence during expansion. Without confidence, operational flexibility becomes limited. Theranos therefore faced simultaneous pressure on credibility and capital access. These dynamics accelerated the decline in perceived enterprise value. The company's valuation no longer reflected earlier expectations of industry disruption. Market perception shifted toward operational risk and uncertainty. The gap between earlier projections and emerging information became increasingly visible. Structural takeaway: when verification challenges emerge,
Private market valuations can contract rapidly as investor confidence erodes. As scrutiny intensified, Theranos entered a period of organizational contraction. Regulatory reviews expanded across the company's laboratory operations. Inspectors evaluated quality control procedures and testing protocols. Operational limitations were introduced as compliance concerns increased. Some diagnostic testing activities were suspended during regulatory review. Partnership organizations reconsidered their relationship with the company. Retail pharmacy testing programs were gradually discontinued. Without distribution channels, testing volumes declined significantly. Reduced operational activity weakened the company's revenue prospects. Investor confidence continued to deteriorate during this period. Capital access became increasingly constrained. Technology development efforts slowed as resources tightened. Leadership faced growing pressure to stabilize the organization. Efforts were made to restructure remaining operations. However, the company's central value proposition depended on device reliability. Without confidence in the diagnostic technology, strategic recovery options narrowed. Employees began leaving the organization as uncertainty increased. Technical teams that once supported device development diminished in size. Operational continuity became more difficult to sustain. Corporate restructuring attempts failed to restore earlier credibility. The company reduced staff and scaled down internal programs. Laboratory infrastructure was gradually dismantled. Assets were evaluated for potential liquidation or transfer. Remaining investors reviewed the company's financial condition. Outstanding obligations exceeded realistic operational recovery prospects. Corporate leadership considered formal dissolution pathways. The organization no longer possessed the capital required for continued development. Strategic alternatives were limited by regulatory and reputational challenges. In 2018, the company formally dissolved its operations. Corporate assets were distributed according to legal procedures. Remaining corporate entities were wound down through administrative processes. The dissolution ended a 15-year effort to build a diagnostic platform. Employees transitioned to other biotechnology and healthcare organizations. Retail testing locations were permanently closed. Partnership agreements were terminated. Investors absorbed financial losses associated with the company's collapse. The corporate entity ceased functioning as an operating enterprise. The biotechnology sector continued evolving independently of the failed venture. Industry participants examined the lessons emerging from the collapse. Regulatory agencies reviewed oversight procedures related to diagnostic startups. Investors reassessed due diligence processes in regulated industries. The Theranos organization therefore concluded through formal corporate dissolution. The collapse illustrated how rapidly operational viability can disappear once verification fails. Structural takeaway: when technological credibility collapses, organizational survival becomes structurally unsustainable. The Theranos collapse illustrates structural dynamics common in regulated technology industries. Biotechnology innovation requires both engineering ambition and scientific verification. In healthcare diagnostics, reliability standards are particularly strict. Medical decisions depend directly on the accuracy of laboratory results. For this reason, verification processes must operate continuously throughout development. Independent validation provides confidence that technology performs as described. Peer review and regulatory testing form part of this verification ecosystem. When these mechanisms function effectively, technological progress becomes measurable. Theranos developed a strong narrative around disruptive diagnostic innovation. However, narrative momentum cannot substitute for scientific confirmation. Governance structures normally exist to test executive claims against verifiable data. Effective boards introduce technical challenge into strategic decision-making. This challenge ensures that development claims align with measurable performance. In Theranos' case, governance emphasis leaned toward institutional credibility rather than technical oversight. Board composition provided political stature but limited diagnostic expertise. As a result, technical scrutiny remained concentrated within internal management. Information asymmetry, therefore, expanded between leadership and stakeholders. Investors relied largely on executive representations of technological progress. Private market structures can reinforce this dynamic. When valuations increase rapidly, external verification may lag behind capital allocation. This delay can allow assumptions to accumulate within enterprise valuation. Over time, these assumptions become embedded in enterprise valuation. Once verification challenges emerge, the valuation framework can unravel quickly. Theranos experienced this dynamic as investigative scrutiny intensified. External observers requested technical transparency that had not previously been required. Without validated data, restoring credibility became difficult. Partnership networks also depend on technological reliability. Healthcare providers cannot operate effectively with uncertain diagnostic systems. Retail distribution partners, therefore, reassessed operational risk. The collapse of partnerships removed the company's commercial infrastructure. Investor confidence subsequently declined as technological uncertainty expanded. The sequence illustrates how governance, regulation, and technology interact structurally. Each element must reinforce the others to sustain enterprise stability. When governance fails to challenge technical claims, verification gaps may persist. When verification gaps persist, regulatory systems face incomplete information. When markets allocate capital without verification, valuation structures become fragile. The Theranos case therefore reflects a systemic interaction rather than a single failure point. Corporate collapse often emerges from cumulative structural misalignment. Technology ambition alone cannot support sustainable enterprise value. In regulated industries, governance must exceed ambition. Corporate collapse is structure meeting unverified assumption. Structural takeaway. In regulated industries, sustainable innovation requires governance systems that enforce continuous technical verification.